everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress, and welcome to today's webinar, Charting the Return of the Native, presented by DevExpress Technical Evangelist Paul Usher and DevExpress CTO Julian Bucknell. In this webinar, you'll see how to get the most out of this new DevExpress chart suite on iOS and Android apps. This session is being recorded and will be made available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you for joining us. I will now hand things over to Paul and Julian.
Thank you, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation, Charting Return of the Native. And with me for some healthy debates is Mr. Bucknell. So say hello, Julian.
Hello, Julian. Yes, I'm here with all the old jokes. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our discussion about our new charting product. Now, charting, we've got charts everywhere, out the wazoo.
Just about every platform now. But before we go on to that, tell us about the title you chose. Why Return of the Native?
Oh, it's just another old joke. It's a bit of a dig at English literature. It's a novel by Thomas Hardy.
There you go.
And I just had to get the word native in somewhere.
Very good. Now, Julian, we've presented on charts before. We did it, I think, 4 or 5 months ago. So what's going to make today any different?
So today, as we've just discussed, it's all about being native. What we've done is we took a long, hard look at writing apps for mobile devices such as tablets and phones, and decided that really if we wanted to do performant charting for such devices, we had to write it natively. And given that the two main operating systems are iOS and Android, that meant we've written our charting product twice over. And that's what we're going to be discussing today, is charting on iOS with a little nod towards Android, written in Objective-C and Java.
Excellent. Now, we mentioned Xamarin. To be clear, we're talking Xamarin, not Xamarin Forms, and we will discuss that a little bit later on. And the other thing I want to point out as I bring up the agenda is we're talking charts, not dashboard products. The libraries we've released are not some way of taking the dashboard tools and then turning them into native look and feel type elements, because there's so much more involved in that with filters and all sorts of quirky things. So we're taking a look at the charting products themselves. We'll start with a quick overview of charts and mobile UI and some of the difficulties and challenges that people are going to face when they start looking at what that involves. And then I'll take you through both the demo that we have in the App Store and Android Google Play Store, as well as building a demo from scratch, just to show you how easy it is, regardless of the platform type, to implement these charts and start setting properties and start maximizing the return on these libraries. We'll then have a chat about the roadmap and where we're going to head with this, what the release date's going to be, and some other things. But most importantly, we do have a number of the gurus, the engineers on the call today that are going to be helping answer your questions. But the most important thing is we want feedback. We want to know, particularly in things like Xamarin Forms, where do you want to go with it? What do you want to see? Are there particular chart types that you want? Because that's going to help shape where this product is going to head in the future. And as Amanda mentioned, we will do a Q&A session at the end as well, but I certainly want some of that feedback. So Julian, when I mentioned mobile, and I've asked this question a number of times with you, but what is mobile?
Well, the thing that we understand about the word mobile when talking about software development tends to be not about laptops or Ultrabooks or whatever, but it tends to be more about tablets and phones. In other words, something that's small form factor, well, smallish form factor, and that you have to be, shall we say, more careful about when you're displaying information, about visualizing information, about getting information from the user and all that kind of stuff. Touch screens, obviously, and very limited screen real estate. It's that kind of thing we mean by mobile. I mean, here I am using my Dell XPS 13, so it's a small mobile device. It's very portable and all the rest of it. But no, we're talking more about your tablets and your phones.
So then I think what we should think about are what some of the challenges are when designing particularly charts and that BI style for mobile devices. Of the most obvious one is going to be screen size, and the fact that there's so many different shape sizes. It used to be that the Apple world, they only had one size, which was great, and of course now there's just a myriad of them, as there are with other manufacturers. So screen size is something that is going to be important, and I'll touch on that shortly. The other thing I think people need to be conscious of is data access. If you're talking about reading tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of rows of data, is that already stored local, or is that going to be fetched from a web service? And what impact is that going to have in the way that your chart is displayed? Because we don't want to get the feedback, oh, your chart's slow, if you find that it's actually the data in the pipe that's the bottleneck. So there's some considerations around that as well. And I think one of the other things is that people need to understand the differences when comparing mobile development, especially in this graphic sense, between large screen and the print style. So if we think about that for a second, the demand for visualization or data visualization is at an all-time high. It's just about everywhere that we look in both consumer and commercial markets. Now, a chart can be used for so many different things. It could be that you're at the gym and you're tracking your heart rate or the number of steps you've done or the number of reps. It could be that you, like I did today with a noise application, I was monitoring noise coming into a workplace to see whether it was of a safe level. And then you've got things like banking, where you might be looking at charts showing savings growth or loan reduction. And I think in my case, I've got both of those back to front. But charts allow you to see a large volume or quantity of data very, very quickly and informatively, and then let you make decisions. So it's certainly not going to go away. So one of the challenges in providing that uninterrupted access to visualization with a drastic reduction in screen is that you need to be able to keep things moving along. You've got to be able to retain what's happening on screen, not try and put too much on there. And there's a few best practices that we've looked at when it comes to some of those things. So we'll just take a quick look at what they may be. One of the common ones, for example, would be reducing the use of titles and legends and also axes in some case. But if I bring up the list, first and foremost, know your user. Think about what it is that they're wanting to see and don't try and overwhelm them with one screen with too many charts. Make sure that your application or your chart is responsive, and I mean that in both senses of the word. From it's going to grow with the different form factors. So if you're releasing something on, say, an iPhone and an iPad, that the chart will size well with that. But also responsive in terms of if somebody's expecting to be able to pinch to zoom or tap and filter, that the chart will do that. And certainly with the libraries we've provided, that sort of thing is out of the box. The other thing to be careful of when designing for mobile UI is making sure that interaction can be done easily and avoiding things like the fat finger syndrome, where points are so small or the interaction between points, the user could be mistakenly hitting the wrong thing, which becomes frustrating. Which drives the next point here, which is less is best. Why don't clutter your screen with multiple charts, because you're going to get performance issues ultimately, but think in terms of if they're on a mobile device, a swipe left, right, up or down can take them to another page. So think cleanly and clearly in terms of what you want. And then position. If you're in working from a country that reads from left to right, top to bottom, put your most important data in the top left. And inversely, if you're working from an RTL or right to left environment, put your most important data on the right, because naturally that's where our eyes are always going to go. And then finally here, watch your colors. Think about contrast, think about colors. And in particular, if you've got an application that can be used night and day, where it might be a medical application that you're showing charts and somebody's doing a night shift, think in terms of changing your color palettes around to suit the environment. And I was sort of a little bit impressed recently when I was playing with my Apple TV and noticed that that's what the screensaver does. It simply shows me nighttime scapes when it's evening or nighttime, and daytime when appropriate. And I thought it's just that little bit of attention to detail that sometimes can make all the difference in the way that your application is perceived. Now, before we jump into the demos, I'm resurrecting a slide that we did show in our big charts presentation, because I think it's also important as to when you're planning the use of charts, and that is, what would you like to show? Graphic information can be broken down to these 4 distinct elements: comparative data, distributive data, composition, and relationship. So depending on what it is you're wanting to show, think clearly about the type of chart that's best suited to represent that data. And then you're going to get maximum benefit out of that sort of environment. Now we're going to do something a little bit different today. Obviously, because I talked about writing this demonstration in Swift, I'm going to be using Xcode. It's probably one of the only webinars that Julie and I have done that's going to be completely on Mac, although we did a DevExtreme one a few years ago that was. But it's really nice just to be doing everything, including the PowerPoint, all inside Mac OS. But
did you say PowerPoint? I'm sure.
Keynote.
Keynote, come on. We are thinking Mac here, so come on.
But what we're going to do is actually stream live from my iPhone into the presentation, so that rather than trying to use a simulator or an emulator where it becomes difficult because my MacBook Pro doesn't have a touch screen, note Apple next time please, but that way we can at least show you some of these things. So what I'm going to do is just switch over to that screen, and hopefully, Julian, you can now see the chart demo on screen.
Yes, I can. And
just to prove it is my real device, we can see that there's all my icons and all my apps. So I'm going to jump into the chart gallery and not into Facebook or my banking. So this is the chart gallery application that's available on the Apple App Store. And the same thing is available, as I mentioned before, on the Google Play Store as well. I'm going to spend a little bit of time now just going through all these different charts and showing you the benefits and some of the really nice features of them. So Julian, feel free to jump in at any time and give your 2 penneth worth, as it was.
Okay. One thing I'd like to say just before we even start is when Paul mentioned screen size as an important thing to understand and to cater for, we're not talking about resolution here. I mean, the new iPhone 10, I believe it's 10, isn't it? Not X. Has 10. A super high resolution. We're not talking about resolution here. It's still the same size in your hand as, you know, the iPhone 7 or 8. And so I just want to make that clear. We're talking about screen size. We're not talking about resolution. Obviously, with a higher resolution, you could, in theory, stuff more on the screen, but that's not a good idea in practice. Think about the actual physical size of something rather than the logical size or the virtual size. So we have a pie chart. Lovely.
Your favorite type, I know, but that's okay. I personally love pie charts, so I'm going to make sure we see them all the time. But what we're going to demonstrate here is a clear indication of sales by region on our fictitious Dev AV company. And the legend is tucked away down the bottom, so it's out of the way, and the pie dominates here. But if I tap on one of these elements, and let's have a look at sales in Australia, which apparently is worse than sales in South America. But we can then see that it's a clean use of the two different screens, two different chart types to filter down or drill down onto that information below. And as I tap on each of these elements, you can see that the tooltip's going to give me, if I need to tap, and this is one of the fat finger type scenarios I was talking about, you can see that the tooltip's going to represent the core data. If I tap in between the elements, it reminds me that I'm looking at sales by years. Drill down to one of the others. But at this point, you can, I hope, go to webinars behaving, but it is such a smooth transition because it's all natively written, so it's just introducing new views.
And in fact, that's an important way of visualizing this kind of data, where you have a chart and then you drill down into another chart and you basically show another view with that chart. Yes, we could stuff it all on one screen, but in reality, given the fat finger issue, having this kind of switching of views with a back button and all the rest of it makes a lot more sense for a device such as a phone.
Absolutely. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is the real-time updates. And I know that there's people that either in the financial sectors or the medical sector that this sort of thing is important. But I'll bring it in portrait mode. We'll just get some data coming across the screen. And certainly on my screen, it's looking really quite smooth. Now, what I'm going to do...
It's doing pretty well. GoToMeeting is managing to keep up. So
what I'm going to do is I'm just literally going to turn my phone into landscape mode. And we can see that's the information being pumped in there in real time, and the chart is handling it really quite nicely. Back to portrait. So I'm doing nothing special there, just rotating the phone. I'm also impressed with the fact that I can stream this live. It's going to make future demos better. Now, you will notice in the demo app, I can't do it on my screen. I'm trying to use my mouse to control the mirror. I can turn things like the legend on and go back, and we can see the legend there as well. So it's really easy to implement functionality to turn things like tooltips, the legends, etc. on, and I'll show you that shortly. Another one of my favorites to demonstrate is the large data set, and I know we do have clients with literally millions of points of data. Now, Julian is quick to point out that there's not 1 million points being rendered on screen, but it's been, what was the word you used?
Interpolated.
Sounds like a posh word. But what I can do is I can start zooming in, and you can see here I'm just zooming on my screen. So there is 1 million points being interpreted and interpolated at that point. So as I start drilling down, you can see all those different points are then, as you narrow into a particular area, going to be rendered. What's interesting at this point is I'm going to add another million in, and another, and another, and another. So, Julian, we now have the chart representing 10 million points across multiple series there. And in fact, the only limitation on the way that this has been handled is by the RAM available to the device at the time. So here we go. I'm going to keep pushing boundaries. We're up to 20 million points there, friends. And again, I can zoom in, I can do all sorts of things, and it's rendering and drawing really quite nicely. Oh, there we go. I've hit my current, it was 22 million when we were playing with it earlier, so I've got other stuff going on as well now.
Oh, you went onto Facebook, did you? Oh, okay.
So I'm going to go back. So being able to handle large data sets, and in fact, I was having a conversation with Alex earlier today, and he was happy to point out that in actual fact, this particular library can handle more points than the WinForms chart can, which is really quite impressive.
So in other words, our native team has thrown the gauntlet down onto the WinForms team. Yes.
Yeah. So now we're going to take a look at the financial charts that are available. Again, I can just turn legends on or off. That's nice and easy to do. And I'm just going to show you some of that zooming functionality, the scrolling. As I scroll through here, you can see the little scroll bar at the bottom there representing where I am in my data set. And if I switch to the other chart type, again, I can zoom in, scroll, etc. So if I tap on one of the...
You're zooming in by using a pinch operation or
just a standard pinch at that point. So I'm not doing anything special, but it certainly does make it easier to show that functionality when it's on a live device.
Mm-hmm.
So tooltips with lots of information you can pass through. And of course, we turn the legend on and off before as well. Again, dear. You get so used to using the mouse on screen, it doesn't work the other way, Paul. I'm going to keep stepping through each of these because I think it's important for people to be able to see all of the different chart types that are available straight away out of this thing here. Now, Julian, what do you notice about this particular data set?
There are always more females than males, no matter where we are.
Apart from the UK, by the looks of it.
Well, it's very close, but I think there's still more females than males. More women than men. There we go. That's because we left.
Yes, okay. We didn't leave all those other countries there.
Yeah.
So we've got stacked bars side by side, and you can just see, again, this is a great way as well to think about delivering multiple methods of or multiple charts to your UI without trying to cram too much on screen. So I'll turn the legend off on that one. I can get some more real estate. Turn it back on, and away we go. And I can either tap the tab bar at the top here, or I can use the swipe. So it's utilizing, or these demos are certainly utilizing the built-in functionality available in iOS. We've got some line charts, only a couple more to go through, and we'll get into some coding.
Okay.
So line charts, again, just tapping on points. It's really nice to be able to see as I move through. So now I'm not sure where I would ever use one of these charts, Julian.
Well, I certainly did in my mathematics days at school, university, but I don't know, Cartesian coordinates for business intelligence? Don't know.
Well, all I
especially an Archimedean spiral. You know.
That one just reminds me of my bad English classes where I couldn't keep my lines between the lines. So I don't know. But you can see there how easy it is just to implement things like turning markers on or off. And you can do that in your UI in many different ways. But as far as the chart control, it's a property so that when it re-renders, it's going to redisplay or not display those markers. Again, with here we'll say turn off the marker, and the diagram simply re-renders. Points brought to you by the tourism industry in the UK.
Oh, come on. It gets warm in London in July. Look, see?
22 degrees on average.
Yeah.
And 13 in the afternoon. And then, of course, highest grossing films by year. Now, this is interesting. If I was to tell you, Julian, that Avatar has this huge return, I want you to try and guess what's sitting out there at 300 million.
At 300 million, that little blue dot. Actually, this is interesting, just as an off-the-cuff thing. This is actually a 3D chart just done in 2D, where the size of the bubble is one of the dimensions. I don't know what that one would be. Like 2007, 2006? Don't know. Haven't a clue.
There you go, Pirates of the Caribbean.
Pirates of the Caribbean. I think that was the last one I saw.
Well, we won't get into that debate.
Okay.
And then area charts, again, multiple settings. And then finally, we've got my favorite.
Oh dear, oh dear. We
Do you
have
know
to
what
have them.
Do you know what I think I'd love to see maybe in the next release, Julian?
What's that?
3D
pie charts. No way. I will
Anyway,
personally go to the dev team and take their keyboards away.
it's all good fun, isn't it?
Yeah.
So now let's take a look then at what's involved in actually putting that together inside Xcode. Let me quit out of there so that no notifications come through. And what we're going to do is I'm going to load iTunes Library, apparently. Close iTunes Library. And I'm going to start with a brand new project, which I thought was up here, but thank you, Xcode. So I'm going to go with a new project. And I'm going to go with a single view app. We're going to call it Sample Charts, which I don't think I've used. And we'll just stick with Swift, and we're not going to worry about any unit tests because, well, because. I'm going to open up the project. We'll save it to the desktop. That's fine. And at this point, there's a few things that I want to do. Now, first and foremost is I need to actually include the charts into the project. And to do that, you're going to get a quick demo on Xcode and Swift, which I know you know nothing about. Julian?
I've used Xcode, but only with Objective-C. I haven't actually tried Swift yet, so I'm looking forward to this.
Well, Objective-C and Swift, there's chalk and cheese. I've been developing with Objective-C for 7 years and Swift about 12 months, and I absolutely love Swift.
That's what I hear from a lot of people, I must admit.
Much cleaner. So the first thing we're going to do is add the library to the project. Now, the thing I want to show here, language aside, it's the same principle whether you're writing it in Java, whether you're doing it in Xamarin inside Visual Studio, is how to instantiate the charts, how to bring in things like the series and bind the data. So there's going to be a few things that may look a little odd. Throw them aside. The focus is going to be on the code around those chart elements. So I'm going to run off to my desktop and find the framework and just include that. I'm going to leave the settings as default and everybody's happy. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I've got this little Swift file which I'm going to drag into my project, and that basically contains my data. So you might be running off to a web service, or you may have some other thing to do. But if I show you that file and maximize the screen, and we'll also make sure that we don't go to there, but we'll go to the iPhone 10 when we're ready. It's literally just a bunch of stock data and a couple of methods around that to populate it. There's also something else I'll be pasting in later just for speed, not relevant to how the actual application itself is put together. So you can see my view controller itself is empty, apart from the boilerplate stuff that comes through, and I'll jump onto the storyboard. Now the storyboard in Xcode or iOS land is just the same as a canvas or a design service in others. First thing we want to do is we want to find a view. Now Apple in their wisdom called lots of things views, so I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to drag that view onto my main view controller. What I need to do here is actually say that we want you to inherit the DevExpress chart. So I'm just coming over and saying you now implement the custom class DXChart. I'm going to bind it to the actual screen. Now, whilst we're looking at this as an iPhone layout, that's not what we're designing it for. Apple basically says, look at it this way, but if I run this thing on an iPad, it's going to resize itself to that iPad screen. So what I'm doing is adding screen constraints, and you'll now see that my view is sitting there taking up space. And if I was to switch that view to one of the other samples down here, it would automatically resize, which is nice. I'm going to quickly split the screen so that I can drag a reference invoking the chart itself into my code. So here I'm going to say I want a chart. This is just a way of linking an object to your source code. So in Visual Studio terms, that's not normally done. Microsoft do it behind the scenes. We'll hit connect, and then I'll close back to one window, and we can see that I've got that instance in here. A couple of minor boilerplate things. We're going to import DXCharts, which is just the same as doing a using in C#. And then I'm going to come through and add a couple of other minor things. So first thing we're going to do is say let stock price data. So this is basically setting up the repository for where the data is going to go. And if I go quiet while I'm doing this, it's because I can't type and talk. Repository. And that's going to equal stock price repository. One of the things that I find really frustrating with Xcode, Julian, is this autocomplete, and if you don't press tab quite enough times, you end up with compiler errors and you're thinking, I'm sure I've done everything correct.
But I must admit, Swift, as you're doing this, Swift does look very C-sharp-like in a way.
With one big exception.
Yeah, where are the semicolons? Come on.
No, not required, my friend, not required. So what I'm doing here is basically just setting up some variables that are going to be used to handle, well, this is a collection of current stock price data. This is instantiating the stock price repository. I'm going to dump these methods in here now. The first one we're interested in is just this one. Is that all three of them? No, that's only two of them. I just need to go off and get one, Julian. The data handler that we're doing there is not specific to what we're talking about with the charts. It's just a way of saying, hey, we've got to get some data off to the chart, and this is a quick, clean way of being able to do that. So we can see here we've got this historical stock price data, and it's implementing the DX time series data class. In here, we're just passing back some specific things that the time series data wants. So think of it like a data layer or a data wrapper around the collection of our data. And if you think in terms of a series for a chart, we're saying we're going to want a count, we're going to want an argument, and we're going to want a value. Straightforward. Correct?
Absolutely. We're just basically treating this collection as an array, essentially. So get argument by takes an index, as does get value by. So
yep.
We're just treating it like a semi-intelligent array.
And returning the things that the actual time series requires.
Exactly.
So then I can come into my viewDidLoad method and just add a little bit of code in here. And what we're going to do is set up that series using a nice for loop. So we're going to use a Swift for statement. And there's two objects that I want back here. I want company name and I want stock prices. And the actual collection we're going to get that from is stock price repository. And because I'm talking about all of the data, I'm going to say get all stock prices. So again, even if you're not an Objective C, a Swift person, you should be able to at least stay with me for this. It's worth it, I promise. The thing I do need to do for the chart is actually create a series. So at this point, I'm going to say let series. So I'm effectively instantiating a new variable, and that's going to equal, out of our DX charts library, a DX line series. The brackets just give me a new instance of that back so that we know that we've got something to work with. And then I can start accessing the properties on that particular object. So series has got something called display name that I want to set. And I simply want to set display name to be the company name that's passed into this array. So we can see we're extracting company name and stock prices from this collection of objects. I've now set up a new series, and I've set the series display name to be that sub-element from inside that collection. I want to then say that the marker hidden is going to be false. I want the marker shown. So you imagine if you wanted some UI elements here to turn the markers on or off, that's the property inside the series that you'd be toggling. So you could have something on screen. In my case, I'm just going to set it and say I want my markers shown at all times. And then I want to actually set the data of the series. And this is going to be pointing to historical stock price data, so that class that I brought in. And I'm actually going to be passing in stock price as my value that I've got to pass through that collection. And then finally, all I need to do is assign this series to my actual chart. Now remember, I declared the chart up here, so then it's just going to be self referencing inside chart dot series. You can see from IntelliSense or whatever app will call it that I've got add series, and it wants a series of the one we just created, series. If I run this now in the emulator, what I should see as bare minimum is a chart with some data. And quite literally, other than a couple of helper classes to wrap that data, everything else has been handled by the SDK itself. So I added the chart to the view. I then added a series in my view did load, and boom, I've now got 3 sets of data coming through. Doesn't look too pretty quite yet, but you can see straight away that I've got some stuff happening. So let's come back into here and think about what else we might do. Well, in addition to adding the series, I might want to play around with the axes on both Y and X. Now, unfortunately, the word axes tends to trip me up because I've got to type it and say it. But as we saw before, we can instantiate a DX, and all of a sudden, as I type DX, we're going to get that helper popping up. And in this case, I'm working on the Y-axis, so I want a numeric Y-axis. I want a new instance of it, so I'm going to put the brackets around it, and then I'm simply going to say axis Y, and I can start setting those properties. So always show 0 level is going to be false. Now I might want to label on my axes, so I'm going to create a new axes label, and guess what, Julian? We're going to call it a D-axis label. One of the things you should notice as we do this, and this is what's familiar across all of the platforms, is how easy it is to instantiate these things and then set properties on them. So my Y-axis label is going to have a format property, and I'm simply going to say from that I want to format the value as a $, and then 2 decimal places. Now that all that's left to do is actually apply the Y-axis label to the actual axes. So here I can say that's my axes, it's going to have a label property on it, and simply set that to the axis label. Final step, I'll come down a few lines, is then to apply the actual axis itself to the chart. So self.chart, and we're going to do axis Y and simply assign my Y-axis object that I created, and we're done. Now I'm going to quickly just go through and do exactly the same thing for the X-axis, but there's a few extra properties, because obviously the X-axis in this case we're going to be doing dates rather than values. So it's still going to be DX, and it's going to be something to do with axes, but it's all, we're going to want to do a date time axis X. Make sure that we instantiate the object itself, and then in this case we want a axis X range, and that's going to be a DX date time range. Of course, that nice IntelliSense helps all the way along. There's a property we want to set on the axis range, which is going to be the, let me think about this, the side margin, which is going to be 0. Now the other good thing with all of this is that there's some fantastic documentation available, and I'll show you the link to that, or at least show you how that is all formatted again shortly. Now that I've set that value, obviously I need to then say the X-axis range object is simply X-axis X range. We'll do the same thing with a label, axis X label. You should have the pattern down pat by now.
You need a let
I need a let.
on the X-axis label.
Why not a var?
Oh, or a var, yeah.
No, you can't have a var.
Oh, okay.
It will be a let. Now, is this...
Showing the limitations of my knowledge of Swift.
No, it's one of those things that that becomes really interesting for those people that do want to. Yes. For those people that do want to learn more about Swift, then just Google Simon Allardyce. He's got some fantastic courses around the place. Of course, I now want to set my xlabel.format, and because we're dealing with a value this time, I actually want to format this as a day and a month. So I'm going to use standard format strings to do that sort of stuff. And of course, finally, what we need to do is set the x-axis label property to x-axis label. And the final step, Julian, is to simply add to the chart, not to current stock prices, the x-axis and set that to axis X.
I think you missed a tab there.
Yeah, I'm shocking for that. And then the compiler comes along and gives me a big slap, and then I have to go back and fix it. Now that would make the chart look a little bit nicer, but there's one last thing I'm going to do, and that is simply to add the legend and tooltip to it. So let's quickly go through and set a legend. And Julian, what do I put next?
Oh, DX Legend, I imagine, or something like that. There we go.
So you can write Swift.
Now
Now with
I just know our naming convention. Maybe.
Here's one of the cool things. We're going to set the horizontal and vertical positions here. Now, because they're enumerated types in Swift, you can just hit dot or period, and it will actually let you do just that, which is really nice. So our vertical is going to be dot, and we'll set it to top outside. Make sure I hit tab enough times. And of course, then all we need to do is add the legend to the chart. Legend equals legend. And I did say that we'd set a tooltip as well. So in tooltip,
Let
what?
Let tooltip. Ah.
Left hand instead
Hey,
of right hand.
I'm almost writing JavaScript at this point.
Well, but that's the beauty with all of this stuff, is the fact that you know, the style of, as particular of Swift, is very similar to a mix of other languages. It does have its own quirks, but that's way past the advance of this. So we're going to say our tooltip is not hidden, false, and then finally we need to set the set self.chart.tooltip equals tooltip.
Right.
One line left to right, and that is back up here in the series. We also want to then say let's set the tooltip, so the series tooltip format or text pattern. We then want to say when you tap on a marker, we want to show you something. And here we're going to actually jump in and say, well, to start with, we want the argument value, and that's going to be formatted as DDMMM. And then we want the, I'm not sure I should use a minus when we're talking about dollars. We want the dollar value, and then we actually want the value, if that makes sense. And again, we'll do that to the decimal places. Now, providing I haven't made any silly typos, when I run this time, we're going to see the 10 come up. We've now got the legend. And if I tap on one of these markers, we can see not only the company showing if I tap outside a marker, but when I tap on a marker, the actual tooltip with the value and the date showing nicely. Now, one thing then, that must be for you, Julian.
Yep.
One thing that I want to actually achieve now is, how would I use two charts? Use one as a master chart that could then filter the data underneath. We're talking a couple of lines of code, so I'm not going to bore you with that. and that's where these other two classes came in. This one's doing exactly the same as the first one. It's just a wrapper around the data class to say, get me the count, get me the label, get me the value. Nothing difficult in there, just inherits this pi series data. So there's a clue as to what kind of chart I'm going to add. And then the final thing, which is this chart delegate. So that's going to handle the interaction between the user and the actual chart. It takes an input of a view controller, which gets instantiated on the construct, and then there's two methods that get called, identical with one small thing. This is points did select, this is points did deselect. So in other words, when a point's unselected, we're going to hide that series. When a point's selected, we're going to display that series. Now you'll notice that I'm talking about the master chart is what's going to be selected or unselected, and it's going to update the smaller chart, so owner.chart.series. Straightforward tap and raise an event type stuff. We're going to go back to our storyboard. First thing I want to do is quickly convert I'll bring my side panel back in, but convert the existing chart area into what's known as a stack view. So I can do that by just clicking on the stack view icon, and you'll see in my properties here, I've now got a stack view with a chart. I can drag another chart on, and if it drags on top of each other, you can just move it around. This time I'm going to give it the class of DX pie chart because that's the type of chart I want. I'm going to say you've got about this much real estate, and you'll see that it's got red lines. That's because it's saying that there are some constraints with the way that Apple build that UI out. All I need to do is come through and say add missing constraints, and I'm now ready to go. Repeating the steps that we did earlier, I can simply right click, drag my new reference collection into the code file here. I'm going to call this one master chart, so almost like Master Chef. I'm going to go back to a single file view and look at my Swift code, and then I've got a couple of lines and we are done, and I can show you that it is just literally that easy to actually implement that master filter. So inside my view did load, we'll do it above our loop for setting that. I'm going to set current stock prices equals stock price repository, and this time it's going to say get current stock prices, which you'll notice is a little bit different to getting all the stock prices. So we're doing a bit of a different view for that pie chart in its sense. So we want to do that, and then next thing we want to do is simply say create a master series. So we're going to say let master series equals DX, and this is a donut series. Sounds like something Homer Simpson would like. And then master series dot data is simply going to say current stock prices, current stock price data, which is that wrapper that we talked about just below, and it's going to pass in the current stock prices. And go back through. Then before I go back and fix that error, we're going to have self.masterchart.addSeries, and it knows it wants a pie series, and that's going to be master series. And then we finally need to actually hook up the delegate so that the chart itself knows when something is pressed to fire off that other code. So this is going to be self.masterchart.delegate, and this is certainly a lot easier these days than it was back in Objective-C days. And that's going to be current stock prices, chart delegate, and the parameter that we want to pass into it is going to be self. And then all I have to do is confirm what I did wrong up here. It's going to be get stock prices. Any words of wisdom there, Julian?
I can't quite see what the error says. It's instance member get all current stock prices requires a parameter or something? I don't know.
Maybe. I'm just going to do a quick clean, and then we can fix anything. And then we'll be ready to demonstrate. So far, Julian, while I just quickly fix this, what's your thoughts on being able to do the filtering and all that sort of stuff?
Well, certainly it makes it a lot easier, and I'd have to say, since you showed me this particular set of code, Swift is very much a object-oriented, very C#-like, very JavaScript-like language, and so I'm suddenly getting enthusiastic about learning how to write iOS apps again. It's there's something about it. I think I could live with this. With Objective-C, I found the weird kind of meld between C and what do they meld it with? Like I can't remember the name of the other language that they tried to do a mind meld, and it was just so difficult to understand.
Yeah, there was one in there that well, because of course it came from NextScript, which was the original crazy language. But you know, I think anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the series by default, and then I'm going to have it so that when we tap on that element, it's going to limit what we're seeing inside the simulator. So here it comes. We get our chart sample and nothing showing. I click on an element and all of a sudden, boom, I now have a master child filter scenario happening. I've still got my tooltips, etc. in there. But certainly, you know, you could make this smaller, do other things with it, but it's certainly the quick example of what you can achieve very easily with a couple of charts inside a Swift application. I did mention the documentation earlier, so let's just bring that up. iOS documentation, there's documentation for Android and the Xamarin documentation for iOS and Android. If we look at, say, the guides under this one, it's all set up showing you how to bring it into getting started with the library in Visual Studio or Xcode or all those things. So certainly very comprehensive, and when you get into that, the usage and the methods, the properties are common or constant across each of those different libraries. So that was the DevExpress native charts in action. So let's quickly, Julian, talk about the roadmap. We mentioned Xamarin Forms earlier. The reason the teams didn't go down that path yet is because of the sheer volume of work involved, and we want to hear from you guys. We want to hear from the people out there using or wanting to use this as to, is Xamarin Forms version something that you really, really want, need, etc.? Or are there other features that are missing that you'd like to see, or other chart types? Either we've got the contact details later on the slide, but get in touch with myself or Julian or client services. We want to hear what people are wanting from this, because it will help drive that roadmap.
Just to say, we do support Xamarin itself. Obviously, since they're just native libraries, you can just use Xamarin to use them and to create charts and all that kind of stuff. What we're talking about there was specifically Xamarin Forms. There's a lot of work required to get these charts to work within Xamarin Forms, but we're not quite sure how many people are using Xamarin Forms, whether it's important to them. If we do add support for Xamarin Forms, it means we don't do support for, say, other chart types in the immediate future instead. So it's a small team. They can do new chart types or new features for charts, or they do Xamarin Forms. It's that kind of choice that we're trying to understand here, what people actually want.
So features expected in the public release, and I've used the word expected there because it's software development. We all know that, but what we are looking to release are some new AXI elements, or Axis elements, AXI strips, constant lines, and titles. The crosshair cursor, and also some theme support for dark and light themes. So we're hoping to get those out for the public release, which of course begs the question, Julian.
When is the public release?
At this stage, we are targeting the 17.2 release cycle, which of course is?
Tends to be November, so mid-November to late November, perhaps. We're all hoping that it doesn't extend into December. We've been trying this year to bring things out a month earlier than we have done in the past few years, so May and November rather than June and December. So we're looking at November.
Which is fantastic. So then we're over to questions. I'm sure that everybody's been busy answering them as I've been presenting. Are there any that you want to particularly bring up?
I haven't been looking at the questions list, so let me just grab that panel and drag it onto my other screen here, and let's have a quick look. Oh, my word.
Thanks for your response there, Joel. We got that sorted. So questions that we can, unfortunately on my interface, I can't see any answers that have already been provided. So Julian, you'll have to jump in and help out here.
So Carlos is asking about FireMonkey support for these. It's not something that we're looking at doing. But again, if there are enough people who ask for it, then the problem about FireMonkey is going to require, coordination between two different teams, and that's going to be difficult. So yes, it's possible to use this within FireMonkey, but I doubt we'll be providing formal support, if you like. And that's roughly about it. What else have we got here?
There was one that got answered about using the package in Android Studio, and whilst I didn't see the answer, I'm going to say yes, because that's the whole point of having the packages available for the different platforms. Absolutely.
The whole point about these native charts is we had to write them twice. We had to write them in Objective-C for iOS, and we had to write them in Java for Android, and they're both going to get released at the same time. They both have the same classes, they both work in the same way. Obviously, with one you're using Swift or Objective-C, and in the other one you're using Java. So yes, this release involves both of them.
Excellent. So as far as future feedback goes, there's some contact details for Julian and for myself, and also the support teams. We would love to hear how you're going to use them, and also the feedback as to where you think they need to go as far as the roadmap. We also have another new product that we're going to be talking about at the end of this week, which is Logify. So if you haven't heard about that, please visit the webinars page and register. I'll be taking you through how to implement logging of your unhandled exceptions across just about any platform, which is again another first for DevExpress, which is really exciting. So other than that, Julian, I'm not sure I have anything else. Maybe Amanda wants to jump back on.
Hey,
hello,
guys.
Amanda.
I've jumped back on. Yeah, the team answered all the questions that came in as you guys were presenting. So thank you to the team. All right, so as Paul mentioned, we do have a couple webinars coming up. This Thursday is an introduction to Logify. And then on October 3rd, an in-depth look at ASP.NET version 17.1. Technical evangelist Don Wibier will explore some of the new features in detail and discover how you can apply them in your own web applications. This webinar will include web forms as well as MVC samples. And like I mentioned before, today's webinar will be made available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel. I posted that link in the chat box. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Paul and Julian. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.